What to do about Joe Rogan? Hello, everybody, and welcome to the conversation. I'm David Schuster. The controversy over the podcaster continues to intensify with the revelation that he used the N-word against black people dozens of times on the air in some of his comedic acts. Spotify, which is the company that is paying him $100 billion to carry his podcast, well, they're in something of a pickle. And joining us to talk about this is Lindsay Singleton. She is the managing director for Rokk Solutions, which is a bipartisan public affairs firm, and she specializes in social impact practice. Lindsay, first of all, I want to read you the comment from the CEO. He sent a memo to his staff at Spotify in which he said that the Rogan's use of racial slurs were hurtful and inconsistent with the company values, but he did not believe that silencing the podcaster was the answer. Your reaction?
Yeah, thanks for having me, David. So we've got here a controversy where we've got two actors. We've got Spotify, we've got Joe Rogan, who are both being pulled across the coals because of their participation in the proliferation of hateful content and misinformation. So Spotify is in a kind of a tough position because they're balancing the needs of their consumers, their employees, their investors, as well as the talent that are on their platform. So there are a lot of stakeholders here that are looking for action, but each one of these sets of actors are probably looking for a slightly different response. So Spotify in its position is reckoning with what is actually a much larger trend that we're seeing these days, which is a larger category of social risk. It's almost a new category of enterprise risk. So companies across the board being forced to respond to social issues that are arising. And we've seen this way before Spotify with companies and how they're approaching things like racial justice and the murder of George Floyd, even the Georgia voting laws, and to some extent even last week, bomb threats against HBCUs. So this is part of a larger norm, but what we see is Spotify kind of going through a number of similar challenges that most businesses are facing these days.
And to try to thread the needle, the CEO said that Spotify was going to dedicate $100 million towards licensing and developing content from artists and audio content from people who have been historically marginalized groups. Is that enough, or is that essentially trying to have it both ways in a way that won't satisfy people who want some direct action?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I don't think anyone is going to be 100% satisfied here. The commitment for $100 million investment towards marginalized artists and content creators is potentially a great start. I don't think we know yet what that's going to look like in practice. But again, this is Spotify's attempt to thread that needle between its consumers, the artists that are calling for Joe Rogan to be taken off of the platform, but then also their financial interest in maintaining a relationship with Rogan, because as a platform, these types of podcasts are very lucrative when it comes to their service.
There does seem to be a move across many corporations towards more sort of social corporate responsibility. Where is the public, though, in terms of making its decisions based on whether a company is acting responsibly or not, or in alignment with their values?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we've looked into a lot recently with Penn State University. We researched voters across the political spectrum and their views on issues related to environment, social, and governance issues, and businesses' role in them. And what we found was that across the board, both Republicans and Democrats very strongly support corporate action on these issues. What was even more interesting was that in the under 45 age range, that majority rises significantly. So what we can see is not only a general majority that was surprising, because I think popular narrative seems to indicate that these are issues that only Democrats care about. That is not the case. But then as we look at the under 45 range of voters, the interest in companies responding to these issues skyrockets, which tells me that this is a trend that is really here to stay. If you look across the talent pipeline and the tight labor markets that we're feeling the impacts of on a daily basis, as well as the great transfer of wealth and the kind of investors who are going to be spending mass amounts of money in the market in the upcoming years, as well as policymakers who will eventually be responding to these under 45 voters as they become the primary voting contingent in American politics. This is a trend that is not going anywhere, and businesses are only going to have to respond more.
And so interesting that both Republicans and Democrats would say that businesses need to do this. I imagine Democrats, maybe it has to do with values in terms of responsibility. Republicans, maybe it has to do with the government not dictating whether, how to solve these things, but essentially businesses fixing these problems, trying to get better behavior themselves.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely part of it. I mean, there is also research out there that shows the trust in our institutions and how that is shifting over the years. So right now, businesses are enjoying a higher level of trust than government is. But one of the other interesting things that we saw in our research with Penn State was that the language that we use to describe issues matters significantly. And I know we're getting a little bit beyond just racial justice, social justice issues like Spotify has sort of brought into the picture. But when we look at issues related to climate, we see that Republicans and Democrats alike put climate change in the top 5 priority issues, but they also think about it in different ways. So climate change as a term can sometimes be a bit off-putting, but when we think about it in terms of energy management, water management, these are terms that Republicans respond to in a much more positive way. When we come back to diversity and inclusion issues, we can see that on both sides of the aisle, there's actually a very, very strong support for both diversity inclusion practices within businesses, but also merit-based hiring and promotion, which is very interesting because we sort of went into this research expecting to see a Democrat-Republican split on those two issues, but in fact, both sides of the aisle had a large amount of support for both.
Regarding Spotify, as Spotify tries to sort of figure this out with Joe Rogan, there is this argument that some supporters of Spotify and the CEO are putting forward, and that as well, look, it's Joe Rogan, we respect the First Amendment and we should provide a platform, but the First Amendment doesn't guarantee anybody a platform on a private business. I mean, if Joe Rogan is fired from Spotify, it's not a violation of the First Amendment. He can still stand out on the public sidewalk outside their headquarters and do a show there. So I wonder if Spotify gets itself in a little bit of trouble by wrapping itself into the First Amendment when it's a private company.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, and you're right. No individual has the right to that sort of a platform. But again, we're threading this needle, or Spotify is, of profit and stakeholder demands. The other thing I would say too is that although we are guaranteed our First Amendment rights, there's also this balance of the right versus responsibility. And so, at what point of that needle where Spotify is trying to kind of have it always, or trying to make a number of different stakeholders happy, what is their responsibility in terms of monitoring free speech? They are, for all intents and purposes, playing the role of a moderator in what is now a town square.
And how much more difficult does it become for them in their town square when they have their client, essentially, Joe Rogan, is out doing comedy shows now and essentially laughing and making jokes about the trouble that he's created for himself? I would imagine Spotify would like him to just shut up, just don't talk about this, go about doing your show, we're keeping you, but don't make matters worse.
I would assume that there are probably a lot of conversations along those lines that we're not privy to, but I think that both parties have a financial. There's a lot of money at stake for both parties to keep Joe Rogan on the platform, and Joe Rogan probably wants to stay on a mainstream platform as opposed to going off to one of the more fringe platforms we can say that have invited him and made him a financial offer.
For the other part about this, and Joe Rogan has been very skeptical about vaccines and their efficacy and effectiveness. There is a segment of the US society that believes that the pharmaceuticals have been bad actors in all of this, that the pharmaceuticals are making so much money off of the pandemic. Is there a certain sort of responsibility that the pharmaceuticals have to say, look, we're not just about making drugs that help people, we are investing in communities, we are taking social responsibility seriously on various things, we're trying to make medications perhaps available to people who can't afford them?
Oh, absolutely. And I actually think that a lot of pharmaceutical companies are doing just that. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry is oft maligned in the press and in political circles, but at the end of the day, that industry is what has saved us from this pandemic. And I think that they are doing quite a bit to protect our communities, invest in them, and make sure, for example, that their testing regimes and research include a broader swath of people so that they can make sure that the drugs that they're creating benefit everyone equally. So I do think that there is a responsibility there, but I think it's one that they're taking seriously.
And the irony is that I think if there's one issue that the far right and the far left agree upon, they believe that that pharmaceuticals have essentially bought Democrats and Republicans into making sure that Washington does not regulate the pharmaceuticals at all and require that pharmaceuticals essentially lower their prices. But that's a whole other issue. Where do you see this going with Spotify and Joe Rogan? Does he survive on Spotify? Does Spotify lose even more artists? They've lost. Let's see, Neil Young, Joni Mitchell. There are others that are threatening to quit because Joe Rogan is still there.
So I'm not a music industry expert, but I do think that it is a bit of a to be continued situation. At the end of the day, I think there are probably a lot of other stakeholders that have more control over the music side of this that won't necessarily allow for artists to just single-handedly remove their music from Spotify as a platform. But it's also important, I think, to realize that Spotify doesn't necessarily make its money from just the music. I think that as a platform, they're looking at their business model as more focused on podcasts, perhaps, than the music itself. So at the end of the day, they will be looking at their business model and what their bottom line means in terms of the decisions that they will take, whether it's about Joe Rogan, the artists that are on their platform, or other podcasters, and the kind of platform that they are using and messages that they're making available to millions of people through their platform.
And it certainly would, I imagine, would help Spotify if Joe Rogan were to deliver some more heartfelt apologies and show that he's actually learned from some of the stuff that's been coming out about him lately. But in any case, Lindsay Singleton, she's the managing director at Rokk Solutions. Again, it's a bipartisan public affairs firm in Washington, D.C. Lindsay, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.